4 years, 3 months, and somewhere around 11 days. I stopped counting precisely after the second year because the counting itself started to feel like something I was doing to myself that I shouldn't have been doing. But the number was always there in the back of my head, the way an old injury is always there, even when it's not actively hurting. No call when I had my knee replaced last winter, nothing on my birthday in June, not a single text when the dog I'd had for 13 years, a big, dumb, lovable yellow lab I'd named Duke after a foreman I used to work with, finally had to be put down on a Tuesday morning in January. I drove to the vet alone. I drove home alone. I sat in my living room with his empty bed on the floor for 3 weeks before I could make myself move it. I want to be honest about something because it matters to everything that follows. I'd built a life around that silence. 31 years as an electrical contractor in East Tennessee keeps you busy even when you're trying not to think, and retirement kept me busier than the work did. The woodworking shop I'd set up in my garage, the garden out back that my late mother would have called ambitious, and my neighbors called ridiculous. The Vols games I watched alone on Saturday afternoons and yelled at the television like somebody was listening. I filled the days. I got good at filling the days. Then my phone rang on a Thursday night in September, and I understood for the first time how much of that had been performance. It was after 9. I was in the garage, sanding the edge on a cabinet door I'd been building for my neighbor 2 houses down. Didn't recognize the number right away. They'd changed phones somewhere in those 4 years, or switched carriers, I don't know. But I recognized the voice before he'd finished saying my name. Dad. One word, that was all it took. I set the sanding block down on the workbench and stood there in the sawdust and the smell of pine and didn't say anything for a second, because I had to make sure I was breathing right before I tried to talk. Hey, son, I said, which is about as cool as I managed to be. Welcome to Dad's harsh revenge. Make yourself comfortable. This story is going to take you somewhere. If you've been here before, you know how this goes. Hit that like button and drop a comment below so I know where you're listening from. I'll see you on the other side of this one. There was a pause on his end, too. I've thought about that pause a lot since then. I think we were both doing the same thing, trying to figure out what version of this conversation we were actually in. He said he and his wife had been talking, said they wanted to have me over for Sunday dinner, catch up, let me spend some time with my grandson. Cole was 2.5 now. I'd never held him. I'd seen a few pictures on social media before his wife locked me out of seeing them, but I'd never met the boy, my own grandson, and I wouldn't have recognized him on the street. I told him yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I know how that sounds. I know what the right play would have been, measured, careful, let me think about it and call you back. But I'm 63 years old, and that was my son's voice after 4 years, and whatever self-protection I'd built up wasn't a match for it. He said there was also something they wanted to discuss, a business opportunity his wife had been building, something they were looking to grow. He said he thought I'd be interested, that it was a solid investment. He'd explain more at dinner. I said sure. I hung up and stood in that garage for a long time, not moving, listening to the house settle around me, the tick of the wood stove, the sound of something that felt dangerously like hope moving around in my chest like it had never left. I need to explain the 4 years, because nothing that follows makes sense without it. My son married his wife 6 years ago. I liked her well enough at the start. She was sharp, good-looking, had ideas about the life she wanted. That's not a small thing, and I respected it. But within the first year of their marriage, I started to notice things. My visits got shorter. Calls went unreturned longer. When I did see them, she had a way of steering conversations I couldn't quite name, a way of making everything I said land slightly wrong, slightly critical, slightly off. My son's mother and I divorced when he was in high school. It was friendly enough on paper, ugly enough underneath. Judith carried that bitterness around for years like it was the most valuable thing she owned, and I think his wife found that existing seam and worked it, found the story that I was difficult, that I'd never fully approved of anything, that I was the reason things were hard. And she watered that story quietly and steadily until it was tall enough that my son couldn't see over it anymore. The final break came over something small. They always do. A comment I made at Thanksgiving about a financial decision they were making. Nothing harsh, nothing any reasonable person would have taken as an attack. But by Christmas, he'd stopped calling. By the following spring, his wife had blocked me on every platform, and my son stopped returning texts. I sent a card on Cole's first birthday. I'll never know if they opened it. So that's what the 4 years looked like. I spent the 2 days before Sunday dinner telling myself to keep expectations low. Just a meal, just a first step, just the chance to meet a little boy with his father's eyes. And I almost believed myself. They lived in a new subdivision outside of Maryville, one of those developments where every house is the same shade of gray and the lawns are maintained by a service that comes on Thursdays. Nice enough. The kind of neighborhood you move into when you want people to understand that you're doing well. My daughter-in-law answered the door, thinner than I remembered or maybe just more put together. She smiled the way people smile when they're playing a part and need the camera to believe it. Cole was in the living room buried in plastic dinosaurs. My son came in from the kitchen wiping his hands on a dish towel, and for a second, we just stood there in the entryway looking at each other like two men, trying to remember the language they used to share. I'd brought a wooden toy box I'd made in the shop. Cedar, with Cole's name routed into the lid. My son looked at it, and something moved across his face before his wife said, "Oh, that's sweet," in the tone people use when they're trying to move past something. Dinner was pot roast. She'd set the table formally. That told me this wasn't just a reconciliation. We talked about nothing for the first 30 minutes. How Knoxville's getting too crowded. How Cole was starting to talk in full sentences. The price of groceries. My son was stiffer than I remembered him being, the kind of stiff that comes from rehearsal. His wife did most of the actual talking, which I'd noticed was a pattern. Then she reached under her chair and brought out a folder, and the dinner shifted. She laid it open between us. Inside was a business summary. Her boutique, a women's clothing shop she'd started online and in a small retail space in downtown Maryville. Growing well, she said, ready to expand. They needed capital to get to the next level. Inventory, a second location, a proper marketing push. She slid a paper toward me. The number printed on it was $200,000. "It's not a gift," my son said, a little too quickly. "It's an investment. We'd put it in writing, pay you back with interest." He glanced at his wife. "You mentioned selling the old place, and we know you came out of that well. And whatever you'd leave us eventually, this just moves it forward." Whatever you'd leave us eventually. I kept my face still. 31 years of running a business teaches you to do that, to look at a situation that isn't what it appears to be and keep your expression level while you figure out what's actually underneath. A ceiling that looks fine can have water rot behind it. You don't decide what it's worth until you've looked at the structure. I told them I was interested in hearing more, that I'd need a few days to review my accounts, speak with my financial advisor. I said it like a man genuinely considering it. I drove home with the folder they'd given me on the passenger seat, and Cole's face in my head, because he'd fallen asleep against my shoulder on the couch after dinner, his little fist wrapped around 2 fingers of my left hand, and that part at least had been real and not performance. If you've been listening since the beginning, you already know where this is going. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every one of them. And if you haven't hit that like button yet, now's a good time. All right, back to Sunday night. I sat down at my kitchen table when I got home and I opened a legal pad. I wasn't going to hire a private investigator. That's not who I am, and besides, I didn't need one. I'd spent 3 decades running a contracting business, which means permits and inspections and public filings, and the kind of paperwork that tells the real story of a company even when the owner is telling you a different one. I knew where to look. I started with the Tennessee State Business Registry. Her LLC was there, filed 18 months ago. That part checked out. But there was a tax lien from the Department of Revenue sitting in the public record 6 months after the business opened. Small, but there. The kind of thing you don't notice if you're not looking for it. The kind of thing that tells you the roof was leaking before the ceiling came down. I searched the county civil court filings. There was a judgment from a wholesale supplier, just under $14,000, unpaid, referred to collections 8 months ago. I pulled the property records on their house. The mortgage was larger than the neighborhood justified, which told me they'd leveraged up hard at the start. Then I found 2 refinances in the past 18 months, both pulling equity out. Then I found the personal loan defaults. 2 of them, both under my son's name, not hers, one for $32,000, one for $41,000. Different online lenders, both in default. I sat back in my kitchen chair and thought about my son sitting across that dinner table, using the word investment. I thought about whether he knew. I was up past 2 in the morning. By the time I was done, I had a picture of a business that wasn't growing. It was sinking. Debt stacked up under it like bad fill under a foundation, and she'd been quietly moving my son's name onto papers he may or may not have understood the full weight of. The $200,000 wasn't expansion capital. It was a bucket she needed to bail with, before the whole structure went under and took everything with it, including my son's credit rating, his financial future, and the savings I'd put away through 31 years of climbing into attics and running wire in January. I printed everything. Every lien, every court record, every default judgment I could find and document. Put it all in a plain manila folder, same kind I used to use for job invoices back when I was running 3 crews at once. I didn't call my son. I called him Saturday morning and said I'd looked things over and wanted to come back Sunday to talk through some questions. He sounded relieved, which told me what I needed to know about how much of this he actually understood. I wore my good jacket. Dark green, the one I've had for 20 years because I've never bought anything not built to last. I drove out with the folder on the seat beside me, watching the mountains along the ridgeline starting to show their color at the high elevation. My daughter-in-law had dressed for the occasion. My son was in a button-down he looked uncomfortable in. Cole was on the living room floor, completely indifferent to all of it, dragging a stegosaurus across the carpet with great purpose. Good kid. We sat at the dining room table. She'd brought out coffee and a plate of something baked, which is the kind of niceness that costs very little when you're about to ask for $200,000. She pushed paperwork toward me, a promissory note this time, with a signature line at the bottom and my name typed underneath it. We just need your signature and your routing number, she said, and we can wire the funds. I'd like to speak to my son alone, I said. She stopped. Just a few minutes, I said. I wasn't raising my voice. I've never been a man who raises his voice when it matters. Some questions I'd like to ask father to son, if that's all right. She looked at my son. He looked at the table. We don't keep secrets from each other, she said, with a softness over the top of something harder underneath it. Whatever you want to say to Aaron, you can say in front of me. I looked at my son, just at him. The way you look at someone when you need them to actually hear you instead of just hearing the room. Son, I said, I'm asking you. He opened his mouth, closed it, glanced at his wife, and then back at me. Give us a minute, he said quietly. It's okay. Something moved across her face. Not anger yet, more like the expression of someone doing rapid math on a situation that is not landing the way it was supposed to. She took her coffee and went to the kitchen. Left the door 3 inches open, which I noticed. I waited until I heard the refrigerator open and close on the other side of that door. Then I reached into my jacket and set the folder on the table between us. He looked at it. What is this? Everything I could find in public records about your wife's business and your joint finances, I said. Before I put my name on anything, I need you to look at what's in there and tell me if you already knew. He didn't pick it up right away. Dad? Just open it, son, please. He opened it. I've watched a lot of faces in 63 years. Job sites teach you that, because a man's face will tell you whether the ceiling is as solid as he's claiming, whether the inspector is going to sign off or come back with a problem, whether the customer is actually satisfied or just waiting for the right moment to dispute the invoice. My son's face told me what I'd suspected since 2 in the morning. He hadn't known. Not all of it, not the real shape of it. He went through the pages without speaking, the tax lien, the supplier judgment and collections, the equity pulls from the house, the personal loan defaults, both in his name, not hers. By the second loan default, his jaw had set and his hands had stopped moving. I signed paperwork, he said finally. Not to me, kind of to the folder. She said it was for the business. I didn't read. He stopped. I trusted her. I know you did. We sat with that for a moment. I stood up. I picked up the promissory note, set it on top of the folder, and slid the whole stack back to his side of the table. I'm not going to sign that, I said. Not because I don't love you, not because I want you to struggle. But I'm not going to put my savings into something that's already underwater, and I'm not going to let you put more of your name on papers you haven't fully read. I buttoned my jacket. What you do with what's in that folder is your decision, but you needed to see it. He was still looking at the table. I love you, I said. That has not changed. Not for 1 day in 4 years. I pulled my keys out, take care of my grandson. I walked past the kitchen doorway. My daughter-in-law was standing just inside it, not looking at the refrigerator. She was looking at me with the expression of someone who has just realized the conversation did not go the way she'd planned it. I didn't stop. I nodded at her the same way I'd nod at anyone, and I walked to the front door and let myself out. Cole was still on the living room floor. He looked up as I passed. I crouched down and put my hand on top of his head for just a second, warmed the soft hair of a little kid who has no idea what's happening 3 rooms away, and then I stood up and walked to my truck. I drove home on back roads. The mountains were doing something extraordinary with the October light, that particular shade of orange that comes in at the ridgeline around 4 in the afternoon, and I let myself look at it instead of thinking too hard about anything else. 2 weeks of silence followed. No call from my son, no call from his wife, which I had not expected to miss. 4 days in, a text arrived from her number. Had I reconsidered? Was I open to discussing terms? I put my phone face down on the counter and didn't respond. I got on with things, finished the cabinet, planted the last of the fall garlic in rows that were probably too precise for a backyard garden, but that's the way I'm built. Watched the Vols lose a game on Saturday that they had no business losing and said some things to the television that I won't repeat here. Then my son called again. Wednesday night, almost 3 weeks after Sunday dinner. Different voice this time. Not scripted, not stiff. The voice of a man who'd been awake too many nights in a row. He'd gone through everything in the folder. Then he'd gone through all of their financial records himself, from the beginning, which had taken the better part of a week. What he found was worse than what I documented. She'd opened accounts in the months after their wedding he hadn't known about. She'd been moving money between accounts he didn't have full visibility into. The debt wasn't the $73,000 I'd found in public records. It was closer to $190,000. He'd retained an attorney. He talked for a long time, and I let him. He said he didn't know how much of what she'd told him about me over the years had been true and how much hadn't, and he said he was sorry for saying that out loud because it felt disloyal even now, but he needed to say it. When he slowed down, I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "Honestly, Dad, I'm not great." "Yeah," I said, "I'd expect not." There was quiet on the line. "Can I come over sometime?" he asked. Not to ask for anything. I want to see the shop, see what you've been working on. "You know where I live," I said. "That hasn't changed." He came on a Saturday afternoon a week later. He looked like he'd dropped some weight. He stood in the driveway when he pulled in, just stood there for a second looking at the house like he was getting his bearings, and I held the screen door open and didn't make anything of it. I walked him through the garage, showed him the cabinet, the setup. He ran his hand over the dovetail joints the way I'd taught him when he was 12, checking for levelness, feeling for the gaps, and I didn't say a word about it. We took coffee out to the back porch and I told him about Duke. The whole story, the last couple of years, the January morning at the vet. He listened the way a person listens when they know they should have been there and they're trying to sit with that without turning it into an argument. He asked about the knee. I showed him the scar. He asked about the garden. I walked him through it. The garlic beds, the winter prep, what I was planning to put in come spring. We didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about his wife or the lawyers or what came next. There was time for all of that later if it was needed, but that afternoon wasn't for any of it. That afternoon was for sitting in the cold October air on a porch in East Tennessee, watching the light go orange on the mountain, drinking coffee out of mugs I've had since 2009, and finding out whether the shape of something that used to exist between two people can still be found after years of being buried. It could. It was there, beat up in places, hollowed out in others, but the structure was still sound. He left around 6. I walked him to his truck. "Cole asked about you," he said, with his hand on the door handle. "This morning before I left. He wanted to know if his grandpa was going to come back and see the dinosaurs." I had to look away for a second at the end of the street. "Tell him yeah," I said. "Tell him I'll come see the dinosaurs." He nodded. He started to say something else, stopped, then just put his hand out. I took it and then I pulled him in the way fathers do, when there's too much that words won't carry. He held on for a second longer than I expected. Then he got in the truck and drove away. I went back inside, poured the rest of the coffee down the sink, and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden in the last of the light. I hadn't given him $1. I wasn't going to, not for a long time, not until I knew that any money going from my hands to his was going to him and not into someone else's hole. That line was real and it was going to stay real. But I'd opened the door. Not to win something, not because I'd been proved right, though I had been, and it would be a lie to say that meant nothing to me. I opened the door because there are some things, even after they've been broken, that are still worth the slow, careful work of putting back together. Not fast, not all at once, but worth it. I know how to build things, and I know how to fix things, and after 63 years I've learned that the ones that matter most are never made of wood or wire. They're the ones that just need two people willing to stand still long enough to find out what's still left between them. Most days, if you stay in it, there's more there than you think. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. There's more where this came from. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight. I'll see you in the next one.